Actually, I'll start introducing myself while I'm beeping away here. My name is Hilary Swain. I'm the director at Archbold Biological Station. Many of you probably know this as the wonderful ecological research site with a tremendous history, a 75-year history of work on Florida scrub habitats. But I was asked today to talk about a different part of Archbold's work, which is our work on working cattle ranches. Before I start, I'll just remind everybody that the next Charlotte Harbor NEP meeting is going to be held at Archbold. It's October the 23rd. So encourage you, those of you who've never been to Archbold are thinking, oh, I just needed that great excuse to go there. Put that date in your calendars. And the other thing to mention is, I'm going to talk about somewhere that you think you might as well be on another planet in a Florida cattle ranch. But it took me 1 hour, 10 minutes to get here this morning. It's important to know it's not that far away. So why am I here talking about working cattle ranches? And I'm going to really focus on some of the ecosystem services we get from them, some of the ecosystem disservices, so both the good and the bad, and how they are a critical part of the watersheds that drain, that drains south into Lake Okeechobee and then on into the Everglades and the coast. I'll mention a couple of co-authors, Betsy Boughton, who's our research director, and Jean Lawless, who is our ranch manager. So Archbold has managed a 10,500 acre working cattle ranch since 1988. That's a surprise for many people. We're in the top 20 ranches in Florida. And it has been a sobering and challenging lesson to keep a working cattle ranch going financially and also protect its conservation values. And I'm going to share some of those challenges with you. And we have learned much from having to run a working cattle ranch on a day-to-day basis. It has been a great learning experience for a bunch of ecologists. We sort of forget that Florida is like a little bit of the West that got left out in the East, if you want to think of it that way. Most of the rangelands in the US are thought of as Western rangelands, but we do have subtropical humid grasslands. In fact, in Florida, there are dry and wet prairies that are really essentially rangelands in the heart of the state. And if you look at the little map on the right, the darker the shade on the county, the more cows there are on that county. So the first thing you'll realize is that Florida is cattle country. We have nearly 900,000 head, and this is beef cattle. I'm not talking about dairy today. And so we're actually in the top 12 producers in the nation, and most of the production lies in those counties north of Lake Okeechobee, which of course are the headwater watershed of the Everglades, and hence the relevance, for coastal Florida. I might add, there's been a lot more people added to Florida than cattle that have been added to Florida in the last 100 years. Let's zoom in a little bit on that watershed. Those of you who know Lake Okeechobee, this is the 2.6 or so million acres that drain south, the lands and waters that drain south into Lake Okeechobee, following basically gravity with pumps. And I'm going to talk about the ranch that Archbold manages. It's sometimes called Buck Island Ranch, which is its sort of local name, and it's sometimes called the MacArthur Agro-ecology Research Center. It's the same place. 10,500 acre ranch, and we're pretty representative. Because Archbold is running it doesn't mean it's some sort of special conservation excellent status ranch. We are an absolutely typical working cattle ranch for this region. We're pretty representative of the other million acres of cattle ranching. If you had been fortunate enough to be here 100 years ago and you had flown over Buck Island Ranch, you would have seen the middle of it as a sort of slightly higher and drier island, shown here in the sort of light coloration. And that would have been Florida dry prairie. So just a couple of feet higher elevation, and the land would have been a wide open treeless plain, a bit like you would see on Kissimmee Prairie State Park. And then surrounding it on the darker areas, so this is a LiDAR map. It's like a very, very detailed elevation map. Surrounding that higher, drier island, which of course was the old Native American Buck Island, were wet prairies and seasonal wetlands and some deeper marshes. So the whole thing was part of a huge sheet flow that came from the north, flowed through and then into Lake Okeechobee. You can think of it, obviously it's not a calcareous system, but it was like a little mini Everglades north of Lake Okeechobee. Large, wide, largely treeless plains. So what has happened to this land over time? Well, if we sort of recreate what the ranch used to look like, and you can see the outline of the 10,000 acres in black here. You can see the lighter cream area is the old high dry prairie island, and then surrounding all the marshes, and then we had a large, deep peat wetland coming in from the west, a sort of big bay swamp. And I want to point out that we tend to think of wetlands as year-round wetlands. In Florida, the wetlands on these ranches, and even historically, many of them were seasonally dry. They dried out, so they were not deep peat muck wetlands. They were very often sandy-bottomed wetlands that would be wet in the wet season and dry in the dry season. Nowadays, if you look at the map on the right, you'll see two obvious things. One is that we lost the big bayhead swamp that was drained and cleared. This was done in the 40s. And then the interior of the ranch is what's known as improved pasture, typically South American Bahia grass or other improved pastures. But the exterior of the ranch, which is where the wet prairies and wetlands were, is still semi-native grassland. That's not to say it doesn't have Bahia and other forage grasses out. But if you go out and collect the plants, you'll find a lot of native bunch grasses out there and a lot of native forbs, or herbs. So think of the ranch as half improved pasture and half semi-native pasture. And you'll see a big slash coming across the ranch, that big dark blue canal. That is part of the big regional conveyance system that came in the 50s and 60s, the Central Florida Flood Protection Program. So that's a huge public canal that effectively drained much of the ranch. That is known as the Harney Pond Canal. So you can see we lost the dry prairie to improve pasture, but we retained much of the seasonal wetlands in the wet prairie and the wetter grasslands. This sort of ties into what happened to Central Florida. I know Bill Mitch showed this version of this. Lots of people show a version of this. So you can think of the ranch historically as being part of that big watershed, including, but not just limited to, the Kissimmee Valley that drains south into Lake Okeechobee. And that watershed still essentially drains south, although involves many, many large canals and pumping systems, and then, the heavily rearranged drainage systems south of the lake. I'm going to talk a little bit about ecosystem services. And the first ecosystem service using that same millennial ecosystem service classification is known as provisioning services. What do people get out of a landscape? Is it food, fiber, recreation, hunting, so provisioning services? So Buck Island Ranch, 10,500 acres. We have 3,000 head of cattle. So this is not your sort of backyard boutique ranch. This is a major commercial cattle ranch. We produce about 2,500 calves every year. That, as I said, that puts us in the top 20 in Florida and the top 400 in the nation. And raises lots of interesting questions. We do not make a tremendous amount of money, even though we run this as a very tight operation, and even though cattle prices have been good in the last year or two. On average, we make a net profit from cattle on the pastures, from lifting some sod. This is not the intensive Floritam, sort of heavily herbicided sod. This is the sod that you lift from pastures. It's often called Florida DOT sod. It's the rubbish sod that they're willing to put on roadside verges. So we do lift sod intermittently from our improved pastures, and we have a hunt lease. We're lucky on average if we net $150,000 a year after paying all our expenses on the ranch. So I want to really sort of stress to you, although this is a very asset-rich property, it is not a property that's generating high income. And I'd like you to think about that as we go through, because this means there's not a lot of flexibility as to what, we're pretty representative, not a lot of flexibility as to what owners can do in terms of investing more into their land, particularly if you want them to retain conservation value. So what is out on this land as well as cows and sod and hunt lease? Well, the first thing is actually extraordinary biodiversity. I mean, we have very sharp eyes at Archbold, so we see a lot of things. But we have a plant list of 444 plants. That's actually 40% of the plants found in central Florida, from the west coast to the east coast. That's a high percentage, and of those, 371 are native. So that's a high percentage of plants found in central Florida are found on this one working ranch property that is not particularly a high conservation ranch. We have 56% of the birds in Florida, 170 in central Florida, 170 species, etc. So there's actually very rich biodiversity on these working cattle ranches, particularly, I might add, in the semi-native areas, but also in the improved pastures. They're not bereft of conservation value. These are just some of the native plants that you can find in our seasonal wetlands. About 18% of the ranch are those isolated seasonal wetlands, typically flood in the summer and dry out in the winter. So quite high, rich diversity of native plant diversity in those seasonal wetlands, all of which are grazed, except for a couple experimental ones. A reasonable number of federally listed species. I didn't put the state species on, but obviously, if you look at the state of Florida and you cut out the existing protected areas and you look where threatened and endangered species occur, and remember in your mind, where is Lake Okeechobee, where is the watershed, you'll see quite a high concentration of T&E species on exactly many of these working lands in the watershed. So includes species like, we have 10 pairs of caracaras nesting on the ranch, many indigo snakes. We've been pleasantly surprised how many indigo snakes are on working ranches. It was far more than we'd initially expected from our radio tracking work. Now, increasingly, snail kites, as invasive apples, the invasive apple snails are moving in, or non-native snails are moving into working ranches, and occasional panther plus other species crossing over. Not only are these ranches important for biodiversity, but they also provide very large open landscapes. Someone once said to me, the kind of a good thing about a rancher is they think at the scale of a bear. And I thought, that's a very interesting way of thinking about it. They think about landscapes in terms of tens of thousands of acres, because those are the sizes of property they manage. So they actually understand, what do large area requiring species need. This is Florida black bear, and this is one of the black bears that was radio collared with University of Kentucky and Archbold, who covered 500 miles in a couple of months, starting off here in the city of Sebring, hitting just about every conservation land you could have possibly wished him to hit, taking the wise decision not to cross the turnpike, or I-4, and then coming back and eventually dropping his collar right next to Buck Island Ranch. So you can see, using conservation lands, but also using many of those intervening private cattle ranches to cross over this landscape. I want to talk about some of the other ecosystem services we get from ranches. Regulatory services include, sort of somewhat counterintuitively, things like prescribed fire. Prescribed fire is critical for Florida natural ecosystems. And we have relied extensively on our agricultural and silvicultural communities to conduct many of our prescribed fires, obviously on working lands. So we burn, a good percentage of the ranch every year. And we've actually conducted experiments in 40 seasonal wetlands. We've been conducting these since 2006 to look at the role of fire and to compare it with the role of grazing. People always say to us, you should be fencing those cows out the wetlands. Well, first of all, we have 600 seasonal wetlands, so this is not really a practical objective to fence cows out of 600 seasonal wetlands. And what we've found is, comparing these wetlands with both grazing and fire, or no grazing and no fire, looking at plants, looking at herbs, looking at bugs, looking at fish communities. What we've found is, in wetlands that are in intensively managed, those improved pastures, they are actually pretty stubborn. It doesn't really matter whether they're burned or not burned, grazed or ungrazed. They're pretty stubborn. They've got pretty depauperate plant communities. In comparison, the wetlands and semi-natural pastures are actually very vulnerable. If you remove both fire and grazing, you get a big decline in native species. So fire or grazing, or preferably both, is really important to maintain native wetlands in those semi-natural areas. If you fence them off and you aren't able to put in regular, really frequent fire, you will lose diversity value in those wetlands. Grazing is to some extent a substitute for fire. Not that we're recommending that people should do that. One of the other regulatory services, and this is of course following on Bill Mitch's talk this morning, is the role of these ranches as a disservice and a service. So in the improved pastures and these wetlands, in the 40s and 50s and 60s and into the early 80s, ranchers put out extensive fertilizer. They put out very large quantities of phosphorus and quantities of nitrogen. They also intensively drained those ranches. Remember I said there was a big canal coming through this ranch? Well, that allowed every rancher in the region to connect all their wetlands into these big public conveyances. So the ranches were drained, and the improved pastures were heavily fertilized, although the native pastures or the semi-native pastures were not. They were not treated with phosphorus or nitrogen fertilizer. First of all, it was often very hard to get out there. And secondly, many of the native species did very well without fertilizer. So what's our opportunities here? Well, one of the things we've been working, and you've probably read various mixed stories about this, is we started at the outset saying, can we persuade ranchers to hold more water back on their properties? And if we do that, will they in the end reduce flow from these ranches, big pulses coming off the ranches? And can we reduce nutrients? And the answer is it's a complicated study. It's a complicated story. So on Buck Island Ranch, we put in 41 culverts to hold water back in this extensive, can you see all those little crisscross white lines? Those are all the drainage ditches. To basically stair-step the water back across the ranch and hold water back in a series of sort of ditch blockages. And what we found, and don't worry about looking at the details of this, what we found is by holding water back, first of all, we reduced flow coming down the ditches by blocking those ditches off with structures. We reduced flow on average by 22% coming down the ditches. That's not to say that the water just stayed there. In fact, what it did is it moved subsurface. So it's still leaving the property, but it is leaving it at a slower rate. Exactly how much slower has been very hard for us to understand. But it does mean that when we do those ditch blocks, we also expand the footprint of the wetlands for those that are near ditches on average by 28%. So we're holding more water back and it's being released slowly, and we're expanding the footprint of the original wetlands. We found on another project we reduced nitrogen by denitrification by about 50%. And the phosphorus results, very like Bill Mitch's story. We got 3 years of phosphorus, and it was a mixed result where we're beginning to see effects in year 3, and then we couldn't get funding to continue it. Unlike natural wetlands, improved pastures, the wetlands have very high phosphorus from previous phosphorus loading. So there is a danger when you flood those fields to a high level that you can release phosphorus. So it's got to be sort of balanced to get them wet, but not super wet, so you've got large floods of pee coming off them. That was a complicated story, sorry about that. I'm going to talk a couple of other things about other supporting services. That's the third category of ecosystem services. And everyone always asks us, what's the deal with carbon on a Florida cattle ranch? And I'm sorry to tell you, of course, it is complicated. And this has cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and vast numbers of researcher hours to give you these simple facts. So first of all, if you just look at carbon dioxide, and you have these big towers for measuring carbon dioxide, what you find is that you are, on average, sequestering more carbon in a ranch because of photosynthesis than you are releasing. So if you look at the fluxes of CO2, There's a lot of CO2 being sequestered via photosynthesis, and then some, of course, is being released as the ecosystem. So, and in fact, there is more. What you want to do here is be below zero. That means you're net sequestering. You don't want to be above zero. That would mean you're emitting. So if you look at our pastures, the grazed pastures actually aren't quite so good at sequestering as the ungrazed pastures. And our current explanation for that is they just have less grass for photosynthesis, which is a fairly simplistic explanation, but probably true. And that the semi-native pastures actually seem to be able to sequester more over time than the improved pastures. There's lots of other questions we have about soil carbon, which I don't have time to talk about. But then everyone says, well, you forgot about methane. And actually, no, we didn't. Methane is very difficult to measure. And am I allowed to kill this thing? Or I'm nearly there. Methane is very difficult to measure, but we did do it. And when you add methane, what you find is that methane is a big release of climate change, sort of greenhouse gases. And if we actually combine the CO2 with the methane, on average in the year that we've actually analyzed, we were a slight net emitter. Now, maybe in another year we wouldn't be quite so much. But the extraordinary thing that we found out, and I know I'm running into lunch, but this is such a great story, you'll all want to hear it. The extraordinary thing we found out is, yes, the cows are producing methane. So if you look at the one on the left, plus cows, the lighter the color, the more the methane coming off that pasture. And this is during the dry season. So when there's cows out there during the dry season, and you can see little hot spots, and those hot spots are actually where there was water or feed. And on the right, no cows in the pasture, no methane coming off. All makes sense. Then we did it in the wet season. And I want you to look at the map on the right. The map on the right is when there are no cows present in these pastures, and the lighter the color, the higher the methane emissions. We have very high emissions coming off our seasonal wetlands and off the pasture in these Florida ranches. This is without cows present, and if you had remembered the scale, the level is much higher. The contribution of the cattle is actually it's not insignificant, but it is nowhere near the contribution of wetlands, which are emitting methane. So this is a complicated story. Of course, we're not suggesting pave over wetlands to reduce methane emission, but we do have a difficult challenge in Florida wetlands where they are naturally drying out. In a big peat wetland, this wouldn't happen, but in a seasonal wetland that naturally dried out, that is a question. So just a couple of last points. Of course, that one of the other things that we appreciate in Florida is just the sort of cultural value of, these were Florida's first cowboys. And I'm going to end here by saying, really, in a way, it's not a simple thing. You're balancing the services you get versus the disservices you get. And those vary depending if you're in a natural area, which is in the blue line here, a semi-native area, improved, intensive cropland, or a subdivision. So in general, you are getting higher services, from natural areas and semi-natural areas, but you're getting less provisioning services. So you're getting, you can't run a ranch on just native systems. You would absolutely not be able to make enough money. In contrast, if you look at the disservices, the very intensive areas are producing a lot of disservices, use of agrochemicals, high water extraction, etc. So I'd like you to think about those Florida ranches as a sort of really a delicate balance between services and disservices, because what we want to do is create an economic and policy environment that enables enhancement of services and minimizes impacts of disservices. So I know I went over and I'm running into lunch, but thank you for your time.
We actually had a speaker to run short, so if there are questions.
I did forget. There is a paper that we wrote in the Rangelands magazine. I'll put it in the back. And there's a brochure about the working cattle ranch, which I'll put on the back table. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much.